Hi, in this presentation, I want to tell you about a very unusual set of littoral caves formed on Lake Crowley in California. So Lake Crowley can be found on the east side of the Sierra Nevada range, which is pretty much this long, several hundred mile swath of mountains in the green here. The east side tends to be the dry side. So zooming in on Crowley, Uh, it's formed on the Owens River. It's a reservoir formed by damming up the Owens River in 1941. This red swath represents the area where the caves can be found. It's about a mile and a half long swath of what's called the Bishop Tuff, which we'll talk more about in a bit. And it's several miles from the nearest paved road. So it takes a four-wheel drive to get in here because of deep sand. So here's the view of Crowley as you'd see it from Highway 395, which is the major road artery running down the east side of the Sierra. The lake's elevation is 6780 plus or minus, depending on the time of year and the amount of runoff from the winter snows. Crowley is a very popular alpine lake. It's got great views of the Sierras. It's popular with boaters and fishermen too. Really like this lake. This is a panorama of the lake. As you can see, you get a pretty good view up the whole edge of the Sierra. So in 2016, I visited the lake on a recon, having seen some images on a friend's Facebook page. Thanks, Jen. It was a sunny June day, and after a few false starts, I found a route in on these four-wheel drive roads. As I headed south on the beach, within the first quarter mile or so, I encountered this cave. Like most of the caves, as it turns out, this one is formed on faults. In this case, a pair of them. And so later we named this cave Double Barrel. Like many of the caves, Double Barrel has swallows living in the cave. We think they nest in the cave. And in fact, there were a surprising number of these birds flying in and out of the cave when I visited. So moving south, I soon hit the famed columns for which Crowley and this area of Bishop Tuff is famous. So the best known of these caves is variably called the Cave of the Columns, the Crowley Lake Cave, but we later actually named it Cave of 100 Columns because turns out there's at least that many of them there. We actually counted them when we surveyed it. The columns here are not strictly vertical. They're on an angle. And on my solo visit, I actually took some flash and set up a multi-flash shot inside this Cave of the Columns, which is a super impressive feature. So this Bishop Tuff, it turns out, has got something like 5,000 columns embedded in it. And we'll talk about the formation of them, but parts of the hike down the cliffs, you just see columns sticking out of the top that are being basically unveiled as the tuff around them is eroded away. So a bit further south, I hit another pair of caves, which we later named Double Diagonal. And it too had populations of swallows living in it. So to get to Double Barrel, I had climbed up the cliffs to avoid getting wet. And indeed, as I headed south, I was anticipating doing some wading to continue on, but it turned into an outright swim. So that was pretty much the end of that recon. I vowed to come back later in the fall because a little bit of research on the internet found that this area is actually pretty well known. And the water level changes a lot. This area that I had just walked through in June was all underwater in earlier in the year. So a little segue into the geology here. These caves, actually the unit it's formed in, was in place during an eruption of the so-called Long Valley caldera. And that happened about 760,000 years ago. And it formed this huge caldera. You can see Crowley down here in the corner. So one thing to note that while this eruption happened, it emplaced a lot of pyroclastics, and one of the major units was this Bishop Tuff that's shown in orange here. And another feature to notice that's a result of the eruption is all these lines here are ring faults that encircle the caldera. And it turns out these north-south trending ring faults are the major factor providing a zone of weakness for the littoral caves to form. Zoomed in a bit more, you see this Bishop Tuff is in the QL, or so it's called on the geology map. And here you see this swath of it that the caves are formed in. So the whole area of in the former caldera are still pretty active in terms of having like active hot springs pouring out, and there's at least a dozen of these different hot springs that people have used pipes and built pools to capture some of the water. So it turns out there's really only one study that has been published of these columns, and these columns formed in the Bishop Tuff while the Bishop Tuff was still hot down inside. It was a very thick layer of these pyroclastics, and it's thought that meteoric water, both in the form of rainwater and from melting snow, drained down into the Bishop Tuff. And as it drained down, it hit the actively hot layers, which caused it to boil, and columns of steam rose up out of this Bishop Tuff. And as it did, it formed, it carried these minerals, one of them being mordanite. And these minerals basically rose through the tuff and acted as a glue that basically solidified columns in the tuff. And these columns, as it turned out, because of the mordanite, ended up being much more resistant to erosion. So here's actually the whole abstract. Again, the only thing published on it, and basically I have this in here. You can pause the video and read this in more detail. But for now, I'm going to move on. So fast forward to 2020, and I recruited 4 friends to come down here with me. Uh, Matt Oliphant and Nancy Pistol, who conducted the survey of the caves, and Paul and Kathy Greaves, who helped me with the photo documentation. And we've got our 4-wheel drives, we've got our sea kayaks, which I thought we would need to get to these southern caves, but turned out we were lucky. And when we returned, we were able to visit all the caves on foot. So as we hiked down to the caves, turned out Paul and Kathy actually found these bizarre formations in the tuff. I didn't see them myself, so I'm glad they got some pictures of it. But they're kind of what I think are a minor version of the columns. That is, I think something organic, probably tube worms of some kind, burrowed into this tuff and uh, ejected in their tunnels some kind of calcite or other hardening agent that then also was resistant to erosion. But I suspect the erosion here is less forceful, probably just due to meteoric water and wind dissolving the tuff or removing the tuff and leaving these stringers. So in this, when we came back to survey, we deemed 10 caves here worthy of survey. So there were also other speleological features, which I'll show you, that we didn't bother to survey because they were probably less than 10 meters in length. So what I'm going to do is show you the caves as you would see north to south. And these are Derek Wolf's maps. We turned over the survey notes to him that Matt and Nancy had produced. And Derek was kind enough to draft up maps of the caves. Later, I'll use these in a NSS News article. So Double Barrel was this cave that I had visited before. Here you see actually the same spot I shot before, but I'd say the not only is the cave drier right now, but more of the sand has been removed from it. And I think the passage is taller and the column there is taller. So another view looking out. You see the swallows again. This first set of columns that you see as you head south, and of course the famous cave of the 100 columns, as we've deemed it after surveying it. So here's a panorama of the whole thing, and there's actually all sorts of little segments of cave here that arguably are under the same drip line, maybe not quite exactly the same drip line, but we're going to call it all one cave for our purposes. And here are the easily 100 columns as we counted them all up. And you don't see them all in this picture. Some are deeper inside in these behind these other columns. But here you see the group, and this column here in the center is an actual double column, and it's actually the only one we observed in the whole exploration out here. So here's Matt and Nancy starting their survey. And this is one of the deeper areas of the cave that I've lit up with, and it flashed deeper inside. They did a, Sunto, compass, and tape survey. This is one of the longer segments of passage within Cave of the Hundred Columns. And here's a shot looking out from fairly far into Cave of the Hundred Columns, and you can see that that bifurcated column in the center. And just a set of passages from different angles, or shots of different angles in Cave of the Hundred Columns. Definitely very photogenic, and lots of different spots for photos in this cave. And this is sort of the deepest penetration in the cave. I'd say it's about maybe 45 to 50 feet deep from the cliff line. So moving south, we start to hit some other passage of smaller caves. We call this one Cave of the Half-White Column. And it's short, but again, has some interesting columns. Double Diagonal was one I had visited before. And interestingly, so most of these caves are formed on those north-south faults, but follow them in. This one is perpendicular to a pair of north-south faults. So it's kind of unusual among caves here. A little bit of a rest stop here while we get some pictures of these features along the cliffs. So now I have a group of stuff that we didn't bother to survey, but kind of qualify as interesting cavelets along the way. Some interesting erosion here on these sets of columns. The water line is quite apparent. Another little cavelet here. And here's a pair of caves. I think this is the one I was in that was on my first trip, where I decided to turn around rather than swim. So here's what I didn't see on that first trip. This whole set of 5 or 6 caves to the south. Some more little cavelets though along the way. So this is an interesting area. These columns are formed, seem to have these segments that are characteristic, and there may be a couple feet thick to each segment. And in this particular spot along the shore, you see lots of these discs that have eroded out of the individual columns. And here is kind of a column graveyard. That it's the only place along the shore you see anything like this. These rows of fallen columns that seem to be pretty well embedded in the tuff as well. And not all the columns are vertical. There's this interesting group that's practically at a 45-degree angle. And again, you see some of the columns are exposed in caves, but where there aren't faults, you just have the columns sort of evenly and uniformly eroding out of the tuff. So as you move south, you start to get some larger caves where several faults have converged. So this Labyrinth cave indeed is, we were pretty impressed. This is one of the larger caves that we encountered along the way. Nice view of all the, most of the entrances to the cave in one shot. And a very scenic cave. I wish I'd been here on a clearer day, but when we returned at this time of year in the fall of 2020, the California wildfires were raging, and it was all pretty much overcast and dingy in the sky. So here's another one, cut column. And for some reason in this one, the columns, instead of staying in place, just sort of were cut as the waves eroded out. Nice view out of Cut Column Cave, and you can see the larger Cave of the 100 Columns way up in the distance here. So besides swallows, another bird that likes to inhabit the lakeshore are bald eagles. And just as we got to this cave, we saw one of them landing in the cliffs above this cave, and it clearly had a nest there. So we named the cave for the bald eagle. And it's another cave with several converging faults in close proximity. So we've still got columns forming here. They're less apparent in the cave than along the cliffs just outside. So none of the freestanding columns like you see in the other caves, but definitely still extant in the tuff here. Definitely proximal faults. And some of these may qualify more as joints than faults. I can let the geologists argue about what we have here. Still surveying in bald eagle here. But from here, as we move south, we got into segments of the tuff where the columns were definitely no longer extant. So they're not everywhere in the tuff, and not in these caves. But here you get a good cross section of the tuff, so it's by no means totally uniform. You see some stratigraphy here where inclusions are thicker or less apparent. Kathy Greaves in one of the several side passages in the cave. One of our further south caves here, Green Crack. And here you see a boat on the lake. So finally, at the very south end of the cliffs, we hit this cave, unusual in its own right, fracture zone, because at this point, the cliffs seem to have fractures running in very different angles down here, not just the more vertical cracks we'd seen before, but something like we'd seen up at double diagonal, where you have transverse faults. One more view of fracture zone. And it looks like we're wrapping it up here with this is a shot of Crowley at sunset with some of the lenticular clouds for which this part of the Eastern Sierras is well known. And I want to give a shout out to Nancy Pistol and Matt Oliphant for doing the cave survey, Paul and Kathy Greaves for helping with the photo documentation, and Derek Wolf for doing his excellent renderings of all the Crowley maps. And at this point, I'm gonna stop